The wind dragged long ribbons of dust across the dry zemley of the frontier as the sun dipped low behind the jagged hills. It had been a hard season, and everything about the land looked tired. Cracked soil, leaning fences, and cattle that moved slower than they once did. Through that fading light rode Elias Boone, a man as massive as the land he worked. His shoulders were broad, his face weathered by years of heat and hardship, and his silence carried more weight than most men's words. He had just returned from a long cattle drive, days spent sleeping under open skies, and nights filled with the restless sounds of the wild. Normally, coming home to the ranch brought him a quiet kind of peace, the smell of cooked food, the soft chatter of workers, the sense that, for all its harshness, this place was safe. But that evening felt different the moment he stepped down from his horse. The ranch was too quiet. No laughter from the bunkhouse, no clatter of pots echoing from the cookhouse. Even the animals seemed unsettled, shifting nervously as if they sensed something unspoken in the air. Elias removed his hat slowly, his sharp eyes scanning the yard. Years of living on the edge of danger had taught him to trust that feeling, the kind that crept into your bones before trouble showed its face. He tied his horse to the post and walked toward the cookhouse, his boots pressing heavily into the dirt with each step. As he pushed open the wooden door, it creaked louder than usual, slicing through the silence inside. There she was, Martha. She stood by the stove, stirring a pot of stew, just like she had every evening since she arrived months ago. A large woman with kind eyes and a gentle way about her, Martha had become the heart of the ranch. She fed the men, kept the place running, and somehow managed to bring warmth into a land that rarely offered any. But today, something was wrong. Her back was slightly hunched, her movements slower, careful, like each motion carried pain. And when she turned just slightly at the sound of the door, Elias saw it. Faint but undeniable, red marks on her cheek. Not the kind left by accident, not the kind you ignore. For a brief moment, time seemed to slow. Elias didn't speak. He just stood there, watching. His expression didn't change much. He wasn't a man who showed emotion easily, but something behind his eyes hardened. Martha noticed him looking. In an instant, she turned away, her hand rising to her face as if to hide what could no longer be hidden. She forced a small smile, one that didn't reach her eyes, and spoke in a voice that tried too hard to sound normal. "Evening, Mr. Boone. Stew will be ready soon." Elias stepped further inside, the wooden floor groaning beneath his weight. He didn't respond right away. Instead, he took in every detail, the way her hands trembled slightly, the way she avoided turning fully toward him, the way the room itself felt heavier than usual. He had seen this before. Not here, but in other towns, other places, where people thought no one was watching. Violence that hid behind silence, pain that dressed itself up as nothing. Elias finally spoke, his voice low and steady. "You are right, Martha?" The question lingered in the air like smoke. For a split second, her stirring stopped. Just a second, but enough. Then she nodded quickly, almost too quickly. "Just tired, that's all. Long day." It was a lie, a weak one, but it was the kind people told when they didn't believe they had a choice. Elias didn't press her, not yet. Instead, he gave a slow nod, as if accepting her answer, but his eyes said otherwise. He walked over to the table and set his hat down, taking a seat without another word. The silence between them stretched long and uncomfortable. Outside, the wind howled a little louder, rattling the thin windows. Inside, the stew bubbled softly, the only sound in a room filled with unspoken truth. Elias watched her quietly. Every movement, every flinch, every moment she winced when she thought no one was looking. And in that silence, something began to settle deep inside him. Not rage, at least not yet. Something colder, something more controlled. A decision forming. This ranch had rules, not written, not spoken loudly, but understood. People worked hard here. They respected one another. And above all else, they were safe here. What Elias saw in Martha's eyes that evening didn't belong on his land. He leaned back slightly in his chair,
his gaze still fixed on her, his jaw tightening just enough to show that he had already seen more than she realized. He said nothing else that night, but he didn't need to, because the moment he saw those marks, everything had already changed.
Morning came slowly to the ranch, like it always did on the frontier, quiet, cold, and unforgiving. A pale light stretched across the land, brushing over the fences, the barns, and the long trails that disappeared into the horizon. The wind had calmed from the night before, but the air still carried that same uneasy feeling, like something unseen was waiting to reveal itself. Elias Boone was awake before the sun fully rose. He stood outside the bunkhouse, a tin cup of black coffee in his hand, his massive frame still and watchful. He hadn't slept much. Men like him didn't always need sleep, but this time it wasn't the long ride that kept him awake. It was Martha's face, those marks, that silence, that lie. He took a slow sip of his coffee, eyes fixed on the cookhouse door. Right on time, it opened. Martha stepped out. At first glance, everything seemed normal. She wore the same apron, tied tightly around her waist, and carried a basket filled with bread and supplies for the morning meal. But Elias noticed what others might miss. She moved carefully, too carefully. Each step measured, each motion controlled, as if her body was trying to avoid pain it could no longer hide. Her eyes stayed low, avoiding the gaze of the ranch hands who were beginning to gather. Normally, Martha greeted everyone, called them by name, teased them lightly, made the mornings feel less heavy. But today, she said nothing, just a small nod here and there, a forced smile. Elias watched it all in silence. One of the younger ranch hands, a boy barely into manhood named Caleb, leaned over to another and whispered something under his breath. Elias couldn't hear the exact words, but he didn't need to. He saw the way Caleb glanced toward Martha, then quickly looked away. People had noticed. That meant whatever was happening, it wasn't new. Elias crushed that thought quickly. His jaw tightened as he set his empty cup down on the wooden rail. He stepped forward, his boots heavy against the dirt, heading toward the cookhouse. The men instinctively made space for him. No one spoke when Elias moved with purpose. Inside, the cookhouse was already warm. The fire beneath the stove crackled softly, and the smell of fresh bread filled the room. Martha stood by the table, cutting portions with steady hands, too steady, like she was trying to prove something. Elias stepped inside without a word. She felt his presence immediately. Her shoulders stiffened, just slightly. "Morning," she said, still not turning fully toward him. Elias didn't answer right away. He moved closer. His eyes studied her face again. The marks were still there, though slightly faded under the morning light. But now he saw more. Faint bruising near her jawline, a small cut just beneath her ear. Not one strike, more than one. His voice when it came was calm, but heavier than before. "You should rest today." Martha shook her head quickly. "No need, work needs doing." Elias stepped closer. "That's not what I said." Now she turned, just enough to face him. Her expression tried to stay firm, but there was something fragile underneath it. Fear buried deep. "I'm fine, Mr. Boone." There it was again. That same lie. But this time Elias didn't let it pass so easily. He leaned slightly forward, his towering presence filling the small space between them. His voice dropped lower. "Who did it?" The question hit like a hammer. Martha froze. For a moment the entire world seemed to stop. The fire crackled. The wind brushed faintly against the walls, but inside that room there was only silence. Her hands tightened around the knife she was holding. I don't know what you mean." Elias didn't move, didn't blink. "You do." Her breathing grew uneven. Elias wasn't shouting, he wasn't threatening, but there was something far more powerful in his tone. Certainty. He already knew. Or at least, he knew enough. Martha slowly set the knife down on the table. Her hands trembled now, unable to hide it anymore. She turned away, walking a few steps toward the stove, her back to him. "You shouldn't be asking about it," she said quietly. Elias crossed his arms. "You're working on my land. That makes it my business." She let out a weak, almost broken laugh. "Your land don't change what follows a person." That line hung heavy in the air. Elias understood it more than most. The past had a way of chasing people across miles, across states, across entire lives. But there was one thing he didn't believe in: letting it win. "Maybe not," he said, "but it changes what I allow." Martha didn't respond.
Her silence said everything. Elias studied her for a long moment, then finally stepped back. He wasn't going to force it out of her. Not yet. People spoke when they were ready, or when they had no other choice. But one thing was clear now. Someone had done this, and that someone was close. Very close. Outside, the ranch had fully come to life. Horses were being saddled, tools gathered, and the men prepared for another long day.
But the usual energy was missing. There was tension in the air, quiet conversations that stopped when Elias stepped outside. He scanned the yard slowly. Then he saw them. Two older ranch hands, Jacob and Turner, standing near the supply shed. They were speaking in low voices, their faces serious. When they noticed Elias approaching, they straightened immediately. "Boss," Jacob said with a nod. Elias stopped a few feet from them. "You got something to say? Say it." The men exchanged a glance. Turner hesitated, then spoke. "Been seeing someone around the past few nights." Elias's eyes narrowed slightly. "Who?" "Man, rough-looking. Been hanging near the outer fence, near the shed." Jacob added quietly, "Seen him once talking to Martha. Didn't look friendly." That was enough. Elias felt that cold anger settle deeper inside him. "You know him?" Turner shook his head. "No, but Martha looked scared, real scared." Silence followed. Elias turned his gaze toward the distant fence line, where the land stretched into nothing but dust and uncertainty. A man, lurking, watching, waiting. Everything inside Elias told him exactly what this was. "His husband?" he asked. Jacob nodded slowly. "Heard her mention once, back when she first came. Said she left him." Elias let out a slow breath. Left him, but not far enough. His hand clenched slightly at his side. "Next time you see him," Elias said, his voice low but firm, "you tell me. Don't talk to him. Don't warn him." Both men nodded immediately. "Yes, boss." Elias gave one last look toward the horizon, then turned away. But his mind was already moving, planning, watching, waiting. The day passed slowly, too slowly. Elias worked alongside the men, fixing fences, checking cattle, doing everything he normally did. But his attention was divided. His eyes kept drifting back toward the ranch, toward the cookhouse, toward Martha. Each time he saw her, it was the same. Quiet, careful, trying to disappear in plain sight. By late afternoon, the sky had turned a deep orange again, signaling the end of another hard day. The men began returning, their bodies tired, their voices low. Elias arrived last, and that's when he felt it. That same feeling from the night before, stronger now. He stopped just short of the yard, his eyes scanning the area slowly. Then, movement. Near the supply shed, a figure, tall, unsteady, leaning slightly, as if the ground itself didn't sit right beneath him. Elias's gaze sharpened instantly. Even from a distance, he could see it clearly. The man wasn't supposed to be there, and this time, Elias didn't wait.
The evening air had turned thick with tension, the kind that pressed down on a man's chest and whispered that something was about to break. The sky burned deep orange and crimson as the sun sank behind the distant hills, casting long shadows across the ranch. Everything felt stretched. Time, breath, silence. Elias Boone stood still at the edge of the yard, his massive frame unmoving, his sharp eyes locked onto the figure near the supply shed. The man didn't belong there. Even from a distance, there was something wrong about him. He leaned slightly, his posture loose and unbalanced, like a man who had spent too much time with a bottle and not enough with sense. His clothes were worn, dusty, hanging off him like they had given up just as much as he had. One hand rested against the wooden post of the shed, the other dangling at his side. Watching, waiting. Elias took a slow step forward. The dirt crunched beneath his boots, loud in the silence. A few ranch hands noticed and turned their heads. They followed his gaze, and then they saw him too. The whispers started instantly,
That him? Looks like trouble. Don't like the look of that one. Elias didn't respond. He didn't need to. He kept walking. Each step was slow, deliberate, controlled. Not the walk of a man rushing into a fight, but of one who had already decided how it would end. The figure by the shed straightened slightly as Elias approached. He squinted, as if trying to focus, then smirked, a crooked, unpleasant expression that carried arrogance and something darker underneath. "Well now," the man muttered, loud enough for nearby hands to hear. "This must be the big man running the place." Elias stopped a few feet away. Up close, the smell hit first: cheap whiskey, sweat, and something sour. The man's eyes were bloodshot, but not dull. There was awareness in them, calculation. This wasn't just a drunk. This was a man who knew exactly what he was doing. Elias spoke, his voice low and even. "You're standing where you ain't welcome." The man chuckled, spitting to the side. "I go where I please." A few ranch hands had gathered now, forming a loose circle at a distance. No one stepped in. No one interrupted. They all knew better. This wasn't their moment. This was Elias's. The man shifted his stance, swaying slightly, then tilted his head. "I'm looking for my wife." There it was. No more guessing. Elias's eyes hardened. "She ain't yours here." The man's smirk faded just a little. "Funny thing about that," he said, taking a step closer. "Last I checked, a man don't lose his wife just 'cause she runs off to hide behind someone bigger." Elias didn't move, didn't react, but the air between them tightened like a drawn wire. "She didn't run. She left." The man's jaw tightened. "Same thing." "No," Elias replied calmly. "It ain't." A long silence followed, the kind that made even the wind hold its breath. Then, the cookhouse door creaked open. Every head turned. Martha stood in the doorway. For a moment she didn't move. Her eyes locked onto the man near the shed, and all the color drained from her face. Fear. Pure, unmistakable fear. Her hands gripped the edge of the door, as if it were the only thing holding her upright. The man's face lit up, not with warmth, but with something twisted. "Well now," he called out, voice rising. "There she is." Martha shook her head slightly, her body instinctively stepping back. "No," she whispered. Elias heard it, and something inside him shifted. The man started walking toward her, not fast, not rushed, but with a confidence that came from years of getting his way. "Come on, Martha," he said mockingly. "You made your point. Now let's go." She didn't move. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Elias stepped sideways. Just enough, placing himself directly between them. The man stopped. His eyes flicked to Elias, irritation flashing across his face. "You gonna move?" he said flatly. Elias shook his head once. "No." The man laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You think you can stop me?" Elias didn't answer right away. Instead, he spoke without looking away from him. "Martha." She flinched slightly. "You stay where you are." His tone wasn't harsh, but it was firm, protective. The man's patience snapped. "I ain't talking to you," he barked, trying to step around Elias. That's when it happened. He raised his hand, fast, not toward Elias, toward Martha, like it was the most natural thing in the world, like he had done it 100 times before. But this time, it didn't land. Elias's hand shot out like iron. He caught the man's wrist midair. The sound of impact never came, only silence, heavy, shocking, unavoidable. The man froze. For a second, confusion crossed his face. Then he tried to pull his arm back. It didn't move. Elias's grip tightened, not violently, but firmly, unbreakable. "You don't do that here," Elias said quietly. The man's expression twisted into anger. "Let go of me." Elias didn't. Instead, he
stepped closer, his towering frame casting a shadow over him. "I said," the man started, but his voice cracked slightly. Because now, he felt it. The difference. This wasn't someone he could intimidate. This wasn't someone who would look away. This was a wall he couldn't break. A Around them, the ranch hands stood frozen. No one spoke. No one moved. They had seen fights before, but not like this. Not this kind of control. Not this kind of quiet power. The man tried again to yank his arm free. Still nothing. Elias leaned slightly forward, his voice dropping even lower. "You raise your hand again," he said slowly, "and it won't be me stopping it next time." The words weren't shouted, but they carried weight, the kind that settled deep in a man's bones. For the first time, the man hesitated. Real fear flickered in his eyes. Just for a moment. But it was enough. Elias released his wrist. The man stumbled back slightly, clutching his arm, his pride clearly wounded more than anything else. He looked around, at the watching faces, at Martha, at Elias. The balance had shifted, and he knew it. "This ain't over," he muttered, trying to recover what little authority he had left. Elias didn't respond. Didn't need to. Because everyone there already understood something the man didn't want to admit. Things had already changed. The man backed away slowly, his eyes never leaving Elias. Then he turned, spitting into the dirt again before heading toward the edge of the ranch. But he didn't go far. He lingered near the fence line, watching, waiting, like a storm that hadn't fully passed. Elias stood still until the man was no longer within reach. Then he turned. Martha was still in the doorway, shaking, tears in her eyes she was trying desperately to hold back. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Elias walked toward her, slower now, careful, not like a man approaching danger, but like one approaching something fragile. "You all right?" he asked quietly. She nodded. But this time, the lie didn't come as easily. Her voice broke slightly. "I didn't think he'd find me." Elias looked past her, toward the fading light beyond the ranch. "He didn't," he said. A pause. Then, "I did." Martha looked up at him, confused. Elias met her eyes. "And I'm not letting him take you." The words weren't shouted, but they carried weight, the kind that settled deep in a man's bones. For the first time, Martha believed it. Outside, the last light of day disappeared beyond the horizon, and with it, the illusion that this was something small. This wasn't over. Not yet. But one thing was certain now. Martha wasn't alone anymore.
Night settled over the ranch like a heavy blanket, thick and suffocating. The stars stretched wide across the sky, cold and distant, while the last traces of sunlight disappeared beyond the hills. Lanterns flickered to life one by one, casting soft yellow glows across the wooden buildings. But beneath that quiet light, tension still lingered, stronger now than before. No one spoke much that night. The ranch hands ate in near silence, their usual laughter replaced with low murmurs and thoughtful glances. Every man there had seen what happened. Every man understood that something bigger than a simple confrontation had taken root. Elias Boone sat at the far end of the table, his large hands resting calmly beside his plate. He hadn't said much since the encounter, but his silence spoke louder than any command. His eyes remained steady, focused, not on the food, not on the men, but somewhere deeper, somewhere far ahead. Planning, measuring, waiting. Across the room, Martha moved quietly, serving what little food she could manage. Her hands still trembled at times, but something had changed in her eyes. The fear was still there, but now it was mixed with something new. Hope. Not strong yet, not steady, but present, and that alone made a difference. Every now and then her eyes would drift toward Elias, not in desperation, but in quiet disbelief, as if she still couldn't fully understand what had happened earlier, or why someone had finally stood between her and the pain she had grown used to. Elias didn't look back often, but when he did, There was reassurance in his gaze, unspoken, unshakable. Outside, the wind picked up again, brushing against the walls, rattling loose boards, whispering through the gaps like a warning. And near the outer fence, a shadow remained. The man hadn't left. Not truly. He stayed just far enough to avoid trouble, but close enough to remind them all that he was still there, watching, waiting, like a predator circling its ground. Elias stepped outside after the meal, his boots heavy against the wooden porch. The cold air hit his face, clearing his mind, sharpening his focus. He stood still for a moment, scanning the darkness beyond the lantern light. And then, he saw him again, near the fence line, a faint silhouette against the night. Elias didn't hesitate. He stepped down from the porch and began walking toward him. Slow, steady, certain. Behind him, 2 ranch hands noticed and started to follow. Elias raised a hand slightly. They stopped. This wasn't for them. This was his to handle. The distance between the 2 men closed gradually. The ground crunched under Elias's boots, each step echoing louder in the silence of the night. The man by the fence shifted slightly, his posture tense now, not as confident as before. But he didn't run. Not yet. Elias stopped a few feet away. Close enough. Clear enough. "You're still here," Elias said calmly. The man let out a dry laugh. "Didn't hear you say I had to leave." Elias's gaze hardened. "I didn't think I had to." The man stepped forward slightly, the lantern light catching part of his face. His expression was darker now, less smug, more bitter. "You think you scared me back there?" he asked. Elias didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took one more step forward. Now they stood face to face again, closer than before. "You ain't scared," Elias said. "You're desperate." That hit deeper than any threat. The man's jaw clenched. "She's my wife," he snapped. "You don't get between that." Elias's voice dropped lower. "I already did." Silence followed, heavy, unavoidable. The man's breathing grew sharper, more uneven. His control, the little he had left, was slipping. "You don't know what she's like," he muttered. "You don't know what I've dealt with." Elias didn't flinch. "Don't matter." The man looked up, anger flaring again. "It does matter." "No," Elias said firmly. "It don't." The wind picked up again, carrying dust between them. Elias's eyes never left his. "You don't get to hurt someone," he continued, "and call it reason." The words cut clean, direct, final. For a moment, the man said nothing. Then he laughed again, but this time it sounded hollow. "You think you're better than me?" he asked. Elias shook his head slowly. "No." A pause. "I just don't hide behind excuses." That was it. That was the moment something broke. The man's anger surged, raw and uncontrolled. He stepped forward quickly, his hand clenching into a fist. But he didn't swing. Not this time. Because now, he remembered. He had felt that strength already. He had seen what stood in front of him, and it wasn't something he could overpower. His fist loosened slowly. Frustration replaced rage. Then something else. Defeat. Elias watched him carefully. He didn't push, didn't provoke. He simply stood there, solid, unmoving, undeniable. After a long silence, Elias spoke again. "This ends now." The man looked up, breathing heavily. "No more coming here. No more witting in."
Dark. No more following her. The man's eyes flickered. "And if I don't?" he challenged weakly. Elias took one final step forward, close enough that there was no space left between them. "Then you won't be dealing with just me next time," he said quietly. A pause. "You'll be dealing with the law and every man on this land that saw what you are." The weight of those words settled deep. This wasn't just a warning anymore. This was a line drawn. Clear. Permanent. The man looked past Elias for a moment, toward the ranch, toward the faint lights, toward the people inside. For the first time, he realized something. He wasn't in control anymore. Not here. Not now. Back on the porch, Martha stood in the shadows, watching. She hadn't meant to come out, but something pulled her there. Maybe fear. Maybe hope. Maybe the need to see how it would end. Her hands were clasped tightly together, her breath shallow. Every part of her expected things to go wrong, to spiral, to turn into something violent like it always had before. But it didn't. Elias wasn't like that. He didn't shout. He didn't strike. He stood. And somehow,
That was enough. The man exhaled slowly, his shoulders dropping just slightly. This ain't over, he muttered again. But this time, the words carried less weight, less certainty. Elias didn't respond. Because now, he knew something the man didn't. It was over, whether he accepted it or not. After a long moment, the man stepped back, then another. His eyes stayed locked on Elias, searching for something. Weakness, hesitation, doubt. He found none. Finally, he turned. And this time, he walked away. Not just to the fence, not just into the shadows, but beyond, farther than before, his figure growing smaller against the dark horizon, until eventually, he disappeared. Elias stood there a while longer, making sure, making certain. Only when he was satisfied did he turn back toward the ranch, toward the light, toward the people who now looked at him differently. Not just as a boss, not just as a rancher, but as something more. When he reached the porch, he noticed Martha standing there. She didn't speak. Neither did he. For a moment, they simply looked at each other. Then quietly, she said, "Thank you." Elias gave a small nod. "You're safe here." Simple words, but they carried a promise, one that wouldn't be broken. That night, the ranch felt different. Still quiet, still rugged, still wild, but no longer uncertain, because a line had been drawn in the dust, and for the first time in a long while, it held.
Dawn came quietly, like it always did on the frontier, but this time it carried something new. Peace. Not the fragile kind that disappears with the wind, but something steadier, something earned. A soft golden light spread across the ranch, touching the rooftops, the fences, the open land stretching far beyond sight. The night's tension had faded, leaving behind a stillness that felt different from before. Not empty, not uneasy, settled. Elias Boone was already awake, standing near the corral, his large hands resting on the wooden fence. His eyes moved slowly across the land, checking everything like he always did. The cattle grazed calmly, the horses shifted lazily. No signs of disturbance. No shadow near the fence. No man waiting in the distance. For the first time in days, the horizon was clear. But Elias didn't relax completely. Men like him didn't trust peace easily. Not until it proved itself. Behind him, the ranch slowly came to life. Doors creaked open. Boots stepped onto dirt. Voices returned, low at first, then growing stronger. The men greeted each other like they always had, but there was a subtle difference now. Respect had deepened, not just for Elias, but for what he had done. Jacob approached, adjusting his hat, glancing briefly toward the far fence. "He's gone," he said. Elias nodded once. "For now." Jacob hesitated. "You think he'll come back?" Elias didn't answer immediately. His gaze remained fixed on the distance, thoughtful, calculating. "Men like that," he finally said, "don't change overnight." A pause. "But they learn." Jacob let out a slow breath, understanding exactly what that meant. Inside the cookhouse, the morning felt warmer than it had in a long time. Martha stood near the stove, just like always, but today something had shifted. Her shoulders were straighter, her movements lighter. The bruises hadn't disappeared, but they no longer defined her presence. There was color returning to her face, a quiet strength settling in where fear once lived.
She placed fresh bread on the table, her hands steady now, not forced, not controlled. Natural. One of the ranch hands, Caleb, walked in and paused for a moment. "Smells good, Miss Martha," he said with a small smile. Martha looked up, and for the first time in days, she smiled back. A real one. "Thank you," she replied softly. That simple exchange carried more meaning than either of them realized. Because it wasn't just about food. It was about normalcy returning, about fear losing its grip. Elias entered a few moments later. The room quieted slightly, not out of tension but out of awareness. Everyone noticed him now in a different way. He removed his hat and set it down, his eyes briefly meeting Martha's. No words were exchanged. None were needed. But in that glance, there was understanding, and something else. Trust. The meal passed quietly, but not heavily like before. Conversation slowly returned. Small laughs broke through. Life, in its simplest form, began to rebuild itself. But peace, especially in the West, never lasted without being tested. Later that morning, a rider approached the ranch. Dust trailed behind him as his horse pushed forward at a steady pace. The man wore a sheriff's badge, his coat marked with the wear of long travels and hard decisions. Elias saw him first. He stepped forward as the rider came to a stop near the yard. "Sheriff," he greeted. The man nodded. "Boone." His eyes scanned the ranch, taking in the workers, the buildings, the quiet order of it all. "Heard there was trouble out here," the sheriff said. Elias didn't look surprised. "Was?" The sheriff raised an eyebrow. "Was?" Elias gestured toward the open land. "He left." The sheriff studied him for a moment. "Men like that don't just leave," he said carefully. Elias met his gaze. This one did. A pause. Then the sheriff nodded slowly. "Still," he added, "I'll ride the perimeter. Make sure he's truly gone." Elias gave a short nod. "Appreciated." As the sheriff rode off, Martha had stepped just outside the cookhouse, watching from a distance. Her hands were clasped together, her expression uncertain. Elias noticed. He walked toward her slowly. "You all right?" he asked. She nodded, but there was hesitation this time. "What if he comes back?" she asked quietly. Elias didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked out toward the land, the same way he always did when thinking. Then he said, "Then he'll be met the same way." Martha swallowed, her eyes lowering. "I don't want anyone hurt because of me." Elias turned to her, his voice steady. "This ain't about you being the cause." A pause. "It's about him being the problem." She looked up, surprised by the clarity in his words. "You didn't bring this here," he continued. "You walked away from it." Her eyes softened slightly. "And that matters." The rest of the day passed without incident. The sheriff returned by late afternoon, confirming what Elias had already suspected. "No sign of him," he reported.
Tracks led away from the ranch, far enough to suggest he wasn't planning to return anytime soon. But still, the sheriff gave one final warning. "If he does come back, send word." Elias nodded. "I will." As evening approached, the ranch settled once again into its quiet rhythm. The sky turned gold, then amber, then slowly dark. Martha stood outside the cookhouse, watching the sunset. Elias joined her. For a while they said nothing, just stood there, side by side, looking out at the land that had changed both of them in different ways. Finally, Martha spoke. "I used to think this is just how life was meant to be," she said softly. "Pain, silence, pretending it didn't matter." Elias didn't interrupt. "I thought if I just endured it, it would stop." Her voice trembled slightly. But it never did. A long pause followed. Then, "You stopped it," she said. Elias shook his head slightly. "No." She looked at him.
You did. Elias met her gaze, his expression calm but firm. You left. The words hit deeper than anything else he had said. You walked away, he continued. That's where it started. Martha's eyes filled with quiet emotion. No one had ever said that to her before. No one had ever given her credit for surviving, for choosing something better. That night, something changed across the entire ranch. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it was real. The men treated Martha differently, not with pity, but with respect. They spoke to her, laughed with her, included her, and she responded, slowly, carefully, but genuinely. Far beyond the ranch, under a dark and endless sky, a lone rider moved across the land. The same man, his posture lower now, his confidence shaken. He didn't look back, not once, because deep down, he knew something he refused to admit out loud. He had lost, not a fight, not a moment, but control, and that was something he would never regain. Back at the ranch, the fire inside the cookhouse burned steadily. Warm, bright, alive. Martha moved freely now, her laughter faint, but real. Elias sat quietly at his usual place, watching over everything, not like a ruler, not like a savior, but like a man who simply refused to let wrong go unchallenged. And in that quiet strength, he had changed more than just one life. He had changed the way everyone around him saw right and wrong, saw courage, saw silence, and understood that sometimes the strongest thing a person can do is stand between harm and the one who cannot stand alone. The night deepened, the stars stretched wide, and for the first time since Martha arrived, she slept without fear.
Time passed, not in sudden leaps, but in quiet, steady days that slowly stitched the ranch back together. The land looked the same. The fences still needed fixing. The cattle still wandered. The wind still carried dust across the open fields. But something deeper had changed, something you couldn't see at first glance, only feel. The ranch was no longer just a place of work. It had become a place of safety. Mornings began with calm routine. The men rose early, their boots hitting the dirt with purpose, their voices carrying across the yard with a sense of ease that hadn't existed before. There was laughter again, not loud or careless, but real. And in the center of it all, Martha. She moved through the cookhouse with quiet confidence now. Her steps were no longer hesitant. Her hands no longer trembled. The bruises had faded, but more importantly, the fear behind her eyes had begun to disappear. Not completely. Scars like that never truly vanished, but they no longer controlled her. She spoke more, laughed more, even teased the younger ranch hands when they complained about the food. And every time she did, it felt like a small victory, not just for her, but for everyone who had witnessed what she overcame. Elias Boone watched it all from a distance, like he always did. He never asked for thanks, never spoke about what happened. To him, it wasn't something worth praising. It was simply something that needed to be done. But even he couldn't ignore the change. The ranch felt lighter, stronger, more whole. One afternoon, as the sun stood high and bright in the sky, a rider passed through the edge of the land. Just a traveler, nothing unusual. But word spread quickly, like it always did in the West. Stories traveled faster than horses, and this one had grown. They spoke of a giant rancher who stood against a violent man without firing a shot, a man who didn't use fear, but ended it. Some called it bravery, some called it foolish, but most called it something rare. That evening, as the sky softened into gold and the air cooled, the ranch gathered outside after the day's work. It wasn't planned, it just happened naturally. A few men sat on barrels, others leaned against the fence. Someone passed around a bottle. The mood was calm, peaceful. Martha stood nearby, watching them, a quiet smile on her face. Elias stood a little apart, as usual,
his arms resting loosely at his sides, his eyes scanning the horizon, not out of fear, but out of habit. Then, Martha walked toward him. Not slowly, not nervously, but with purpose. She stopped beside him, looking out at the same open land. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then she said, "I've been thinking." Elias glanced at her briefly. "Dangerous thing," he replied quietly. She smiled faintly. "I used to think I was weak." Her voice wasn't shaky anymore. It was steady, grounded. "I thought staying quiet, enduring everything, that's what made me strong." A pause. "But I was wrong." Elias didn't interrupt. "You showed me something different," she continued, "not just by standing up to him, but by not becoming like him." Her eyes shifted toward him. That kind of strength I'd never seen before. Elias looked back at the horizon. "It ain't strength." "It is," she replied firmly. He didn't argue, because deep down, he understood what she meant. A soft wind moved across the land, carrying the scent of dust and dry grass. Martha took a slow breath. "I don't know what comes next," she admitted. Elias nodded slightly. "You don't have to." She looked at him, confused. He finally turned fully toward her. "You already did the hard part," he said. A pause. "You walked away." The same words he had told her before. But this time, they landed differently. Stronger. Deeper. Because now, she believed them. As the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in shades of amber and fire, the ranch behind them filled with quiet life. Laughter echoed softly. Boots shuffled. The world kept moving. But for a moment, everything felt still. Peaceful. Earned. Far away, beyond the hills, and beyond the reach of that land, a lone man rode under a fading sky. The same man, but he looked smaller now. Not because he had changed in size, but because he had lost something he once believed he owned. Control, power, fear. And without those things, he was just a man, nothing more. He didn't turn back. Not this time. Not ever again. Back at the ranch, night slowly settled in. Lanterns lit up once more. The cookhouse glowed warmly against the darkness. The stars stretched wide across the sky, silent witnesses to everything that had happened. Inside, Martha prepared the evening meal, humming softly to herself, a sound no one had heard from her before. Outside, Elias stood alone for a moment, looking up at the stars, not searching, not worrying, just standing, at peace. This land was still wild, still harsh, still unforgiving, but within it, a small place existed where something stronger than fear had taken root.
Respect, courage, and the understanding that silence doesn't protect anyone. Elias finally turned and walked back toward the light of the ranch, toward the people, toward the life that had grown stronger because one man chose to stand, and one woman chose to walk away. And in that simple truth, the story found its end. Not in violence, not in revenge, but in something far more powerful. Justice without cruelty, strength without fear, and a future no longer chained to the past.